Welcome to Conversations in Bioethics, a podcast series in which we discuss contemporary bioethics issues with Cleveland State faculty and other professionals. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Toni Nicoletti from the Department of Philosophy and Comparative Religion here at Cleveland State University. And in this special episode, I'm actually posting an interview that I did on another podcast, which is called Apply Topically, a podcast about current events and counselor response. And it's hosted from the Department of Counseling with Elliot Ingersoll. And in the interview, Elliot and Stephanie, who are members of the faculty there, interview me about a different topic on the philosophy of happiness, which is a course that I teach at Cleveland State. And we do apply the issue of what is the right theory of happiness to the area of counseling. And so I thought it would be an appropriate topic, broadly speaking, for this podcast. So I hope you enjoy this special podcast.
Welcome, Toni.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm actually really looking forward to this.
Toni is an adjunct professor in bioethics at Cleveland State, holds her PhD from Vanderbilt University, and has expertise in ethics, bioethics, and practical reasoning. And her research includes the role emotions play in decision-making. She's also the host of a podcast, Conversations in Bioethics. That's good to have you.
Yeah, good to be here. I'm used to being the interviewer, so this will be interesting. But hopefully it'll be a conversation like we try to do too, so we'll have a back and forth.
Yeah, and we were looking at the topic of happiness. Who doesn't want to be happier?
Right, this is uplifting.
Yeah, I would take, someone want to kick it up a notch, I'd be like, sure. Yeah, happy's good, right? Happy is always assumed to be good.
Right. Well, in philosophy, you might find out that, happy is good, but it's not what you think it is. So I teach this class called the Philosophy of Happiness, and I thought the first thing that would be nice to do is distinguish it a little bit from the psychology of happiness. And the way I teach it, I don't think there is a hard line, although I do think philosophers really do try to distinguish it from that. And the way that you can distinguish it very broadly is psychologists are primarily interested in the causes of happiness. And they will oftentimes assume a definition of happiness. I do think there's one that has in the current psychology is fairly popular. We could talk about that. And also some changes in that. And then in the philosophy of happiness, we say that we're interested in studying what does happiness mean? The nature of happiness. And so I think in one book that I've used, the authors say that, if you want to study the causes of happiness, you need to know, well, what is it that we're studying before you can figure out what are the causes? Now, I actually do think, and I think most philosophers would agree, that you can have some of both, right? You can't study the definition of happiness in a vacuum. If you have a definition of happiness and nobody's happy by that definition, then probably something's gone wrong. But I do think philosophers think of themselves as studying human nature as well, and and I do think the ancient view is pretty normative, right? It is an evaluative concept in particular. But that is what broadly would distinguish them. Is
it fair to say, in psychology and counseling, we look for the causes of happiness. So does philosophy look at happiness as a symptom of something else and try to say, well, what is that? Yeah, well, I guess the way I'm stuck in psychological jargon. Probably.
I mean, when the psychologists look at if you're not happy as being a symptom. So, for example, one of the things I will say to my students is happiness can be a descriptive descriptive concept. So I might say Elliot seemed really happy today, or Elliot looked happy, but it's not a descriptive concept in the way that if I said you have blue eyes and brown hair and you're happy, right? Especially when we say somebody's unhappy. When we say that somebody's unhappy, we often mean it as something like we need to examine what's gone wrong, right? If I say you have blue eyes, we just treat that as a fact about you. But oftentimes happiness and unhappiness can mean something more, that Sue got a divorce last year and she's still deeply unhappy. You know, what's going on here? What can we do to change that or something? So I do think we treat, generally speaking, treat happiness as something of a symptom. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I was just thinking that is interesting about, like you said, the philosophy of happiness is about, if I'm right, like exploring what happiness is, not just the psychological counseling approach of how to spur happiness or how to help people be happy, but rather like what are we saying happiness even is to begin with? Right. Because I think there's maybe some assumptions that we make in the field of psychology and counseling about just an assumption of what happiness is versus maybe being curious about how people define happiness.
Right. Yeah, and I think that this has actually come up again recently. So I had shared an excerpt with you and from Martin Seligman.
Yeah,
and so Flourish, right.
Flourish.
And so Martin Seligman is one of the founders or one of the people who really made happiness psychology what it is, kind of put on the map as a respectable...
positive psychology.
Positive, I couldn't think of,
I think authentic happiness was part of that, but
Right.
He's the guy.
Yeah, he's the guy, and he's somebody who I do think actually made it respectable and something people are studying. And he started out with this idea that I think he was a research psychologist working on mental disorders, or I'm not exactly sure specifically which area. And he had decided that, like, well, why do we always study? It's important to study why things go so wrongly for people.
Right.
But what about studying how we can not just get to normal functioning, but we can help people to become happier?
Yep.
And he in particular is somebody I think is very interesting over the past few years. And I think that book was published around 14 or 15. I don't know. It's a few years old, maybe a little bit older. And he actually very explicitly at the beginning of the book says, I've changed my theory of what happiness is.
I loved that because psychologists don't often write it. So it was like,
Right. Yeah.
He changed his,
Yeah, and so he actually went back to a somewhat more, his view of it isn't the same, but he went back to this more ancient idea of happiness as human flourishing or well-being, as opposed to, I don't know, what do you think, what do you both, whether it's you or not, think that the common, connotation of happiness is like to say, what do you think people,
Well, one of the things that was just coming to mind is thinking about, maybe it's on my mind because I'm going to be teaching our Foundations and Counseling Skills course tonight. One of the things that we talk with our early counseling students about is about how the field of counseling is focused on wellness, right? Not just symptom reduction, but supporting people's wellness and community wellness, all of that. But I think it would be interesting, and I hope that our students listen to this particular episode to help push their mind to think, what is wellness, what is happiness? Because I think our students often think about it as like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so many of the times the communities that our students are working with are struggling with just the basics, that maybe this idea that we could support somebody's pursuit of happiness and wellness is like, oh, that feels far-fetched, like to help somebody pursue self-actualization, like we don't have the luxury of that. So I think hearing about the philosophy of happiness is going to be helpful for us and our students, because I think this idea that can only be pursued once your base level needs are met is not necessarily.
As you know, we talk happiness as a state. You could be food insecure and experience happiness. You know, one of the things I made a couple of notes. One of the things he said he added was about happiness includes meaning and purpose. That his original, like he had positive emotions, engagement, self-esteem, optimism, and resilience. But then that I think it was one of his students or colleagues challenged him to add meaning.
Right. Yeah. Well, let me just say a couple of things about Seligman there. So the original theory, or the one that he compares the new one to in that book, is authentic happiness versus well-being. And well-being itself, or at least the way, like thinking about the ancients, their view of happiness was something like, the word is eudaimonia. And it doesn't translate, it translates as human flourishing or well-being or how to live well. And where it differs, I think, is that it's not really about a mental state of the person, whereas we tend to think of happiness as some kind of state of the person, right? That you're in a state of being satisfied with your life, or you have a lot of positive emotions, your mood is up. We tend to think about it that way. And Seligman was in this camp with the contemporary psychologists who he called it authentic happiness, and he said the test of it is something like life satisfaction.
Yeah.
And the reason he changed, he said, is because this is the criticism of these views, is that how do you determine whether people have life satisfaction? You go ask them, right? And so maybe you say on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life these days? And so maybe the people in the upper range, those are the people you classify as happy, and you want to study their, you know, what kinds of activities do they engage in, and et cetera. And Seligman realized, and this has been studied, that a criticism of these kinds of judgments is that people, well, first of all, what people will reflect on to get to that judgment. One, let's say you ask them about your life overall. Well, what people tend to do is they just sort of start going through, they're not giving a survey of their life overall. They just start cobbling up a couple of things that could give them enough evidence to say I'm happy or I'm unhappy. So it's not really a really, you could ask them a week later, and if something significant happened that week, their overall judgment of life will differ from maybe a week ago. Okay?
Right.
And then, as Seligman points out at the beginning of that book, I think, he says, but also people could take into account different things. Like one person might be thinking of pleasant experiences, another person might be thinking of goal success. They have different things in mind. And so he changed his view to what he calls a view about well-being. He doesn't even like the word happiness, he says. I think he says he's never really liked it, but the publishers kind of pushed him to use it. So
It would sell more titles.
Yeah.
The happiness diet
people
would
want to
have
read
done a
about
lot.
happiness. Absolutely. So there's 5 criteria, and people call it PERMA. So there's positive affect, positive mood. E is engagement, or what we call flow. People call flow. We could talk a little bit about that. Flow state. R is relationships, positive relationships. M is meaning, and A is achievement. And he says in order to get in the list, that factor had to be something that people pursue for its own sake. It can't be subsumed under one of the other categories. So he says people will pursue meaning. I mean, by implication, people will pursue meaning and trade it for even when it doesn't give them positive affect. So that puts it into the list as something we do pursue as an end in itself, and not because it makes us necessarily feel good. And so that is how meaning got in there.
Okay, and that's important. I study ego development, and it's the stories we tell ourselves. But like there's conventional and post-conventional. And one of the things people think is the later my ego stage, the happier I'll be. And we're always really trying to dissuade people from that idea because, frankly, the later the stage, the less you feel like you fit in a conventional society, the harder it is for people to get you. And your life could just be a train wreck, and you're fully out there.
Right.
In some senses, you might be flourishing.
Right. And so you're saying that is a life that doesn't have meaning, or can you explain a little more?
The more at the later post-conventional stages, people really live more for meaning. They seek it out.
Okay.
And they're less bound by conventional constraints than at earlier stages.
Okay. And so you're saying that people at those later stages, they will have meaning, but they will not have...
They may not feel great, and their life may be a train wreck in other respects.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's interesting about those 5 factors, because you can look through them and see maybe... Now, I'm not saying this is the be-all, end-all list. I mean, there's certainly, could be other factors, but let's say it's a pretty decent, working list. You could look at, well, where are they failing otherwise? Now, the interesting thing, too, about meaning is that there have been studies that have shown that meaning and happiness, if you, I guess, classify happiness as positive affect or something like that, there is a correlation between a meaningful life and a happy life. However, it also can get pulled apart. So like parenting is a really good example of that, where people actually kind of make the mistake. They go into parenting thinking this is going to make their lives happier, but the studies show that their hedonic tone dips during parenting. However, they will report higher meaning than maybe their counterparts who aren't raising children, but the counterparts will report greater levels of happiness.
Right. Well, and this aligns with one of my favorite approaches to therapy is called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, and one of the core components of ACT is helping people identify what their values are in life that drive meaning, for them to have a life that feels like it's filled with meaning. And that's a part of the kind of the psychoeducation that I do with my clients, is about helping them realize that pursuing values does not necessarily mean positive affect. In fact, pursuing values often can bring more struggles. But yes, the trade-off is for meaning.
Yeah, and I think in an article I was reading recently, even just getting ready for this, I think that was exactly what they were saying is, you know, meaning is about pursuing these greater values. And some people, I was curious how you define meaning, because there's this little debate in philosophy about is meaning, it has a subjective component, it feels like, you know, it's valuable to you. But for example, Susan Wolf, she's a philosopher who's contributed to this discussion. I can't think of a book or article title offhand, but she says that, I think she's the one who wrote this article, The Importance of What We Care About. And she's arguing, I think there were a couple of philosophers having this debate about if your child, what do you want for your children? You want them to have things they care about. But it matters to you what they care about. Like in general, maybe if they care about something very, very idiosyncratic as a little hobby, that's okay.
But you don't want a white nationalist kid who's into Nazis and you know, wow, this
that's
is
what
so
they're passionate about, right? And so
you want a constructive vocation,
right? And so her thing is that it also has a subjective component, that what they care about should also be valuable or good, and so the idea is that, and I think in Seligman's discussion, he says that meaningful lives, or when we get into the aspect of our lives where meaning enters the picture, we are pursuing something that has a larger purpose. It's not just a personal goal. Would that line up? Because I was just curious based on that post-conventional stage.
Yeah, very much. And I think that idea that there is, you know, it's meaningful to the person, and yet they're also, someone who told me, I want to be like a bottle of fine wine at the end of my life, and I want to be all emptied out.
Right.
And then, you know, but that implies like sharing and kind of giving oneself out to the rest of the world.
Right, right. That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's also interesting. I use this thing called a values card sort with some of my clients, and it has about like 100 different values, and obviously it's not exhaustive, but it really helps clients who are struggling to identify what their values are in life. And it gives them ideas for, oh, that's a thing I didn't realize I valued, but now if you put this word to it, I do. And I find that sometimes clients are apprehensive to select values that seem to be primarily self-serving, because there can be a sense of shame or guilt around this, that I shouldn't be valuing something so much that is not giving to other people, that there's like a, I don't know, societal shame.
Can you give us can you give an example of one that might be a self-referencing one that somebody would be embarrassed to choose?
Yeah, one of them I think in the particular values card sort I'm thinking of was play.
Okay.
And being playful. And I think there's one, there's creativity, obviously that's different though. And the playful one, really a lot of play is about positive affect. It's about, I don't know, whatever you think of play is.
Yeah.
And so this idea of play doesn't necessarily always benefit other people.
And it's not work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think for some folks, like selecting that can feel like, oh, like, should I value this?
I could give you a reason to say why they should.
Yeah, I would love to hear this.
We just read about play last week in my class.
Yeah.
So I have a little bit of a passion about the ancient theory of happiness, because I always feel like if people go back to that a little bit more, it can help them. Because I think in our world, generally speaking, outside of your students, we tend to think of happiness as something that's outside of us. Like if I get the money, I get the car, I get the relationship, I get this thing outside of me, and we focus less on internal change or something like that. And the ancients...
Tony, real quick, just for our listeners,
Sure.
who are some of the ancients that stand out for you in this area?
Okay, so one of the several examples I'll give you. Aristotle is typically the poster child for the ancient view of happiness as human flourishing, and also the ancient view developing virtues, or broadly speaking, their excellences or excellent character. Character development would be important. Aristotle, though, could have been a pretty good contemporary psychologist, because he recognized that you did need some external goods. You couldn't do it all on your own, and then the Stoics would be in there. And of course, the Stoics think that we should become more detached and want the world to be the way, line up our desires with the way the world is, rather than trying to change it. We should be trying to change our desires to match the world.
I don't see that flying in America.
Boy, it doesn't. Now, interestingly, when people go that opposite route of money is success, happiness is success, or something external, they always go, they're very drawn to Buddhism. But Buddhism and this idea of meditation, because they want to achieve that inner serenity, right, and calm the storm. But Buddhism, and in one book I used, they really put Buddhism and Stoicism together, because the ideal of a flourishing life is one in which you develop this inner equanimity, so that you are not ruffled by life's storms. Now, the thing about the ancient Stoics is that they focus much more on the cognitive side of that, the Western rationalism. And so, for example, in Epictetus's handbooks, he does have these exercises like, look at that cup, now look at your wife. They're both something that could be gone tomorrow, and you need to get kind of detached from that. I mean, it really is about coming to some acceptance of, but he does carry it pretty far. And I think the Roman Stoics, Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, are actually very wise on this. They were politically engaged, and so they were living, Epictetus also got to have some notoriety too. But the Buddhist has a broader conception of that, with the compassionate detachment and, achieving it through meditation. So there's a different maybe means to it, but there actually is a similarity, but you're right, it's not very popular. And then Plato would be another one who he thought that we flourish when we become a just person, and for him, a just person has internal psychic harmony. Their reason isn't, but the reason is in control of the appetites and what he calls spirit, which would be like emotion, or the thing that motivates us to take up causes and, something like that. So those would be the ancient theorists.
And that's helpful. Yeah, just for people who want to kind of dig a little deeper.
Yeah. But it kind of culminates in, or the one that people like is Aristotle, because he thinks that he thinks that intellectual virtues are important. He is a philosopher and was a scientist. He's also impressed and realizes that we're social creatures, and so we should develop these character traits that will help us flourish in our social lives, And so, for example, the one that people usually remember is courage. And if you know, Aristotle's golden mean, so courage for him is the mean between extremes, where you're not rash and you're not a coward. And you learn all this through training, and ideally through good moral upbringing, because it's easier to develop these habits than to undo them. And he thinks that when you've achieved that virtue, you have sort of taken in your learning from your moral exemplars and your trainers. And so there's kind of a rationality built into it, but it looks like it's instinct. So, for example, the courageous person knows how to pick their battles, right? So there's this rationality built into it. but they become good at doing the right thing in the right circumstances at the right time with the right people. So it is a perfectionist view.
It sounds like a tall order.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what you were saying before that, kind of this, I think you said it was Aristotle, like focus on self-development, character development.
So when you were talking about play.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay, so have you heard of Martha Nussbaum? She's a contemporary philosopher. And she does a lot of work in the ancients. And she developed, it's called capabilities theory. And it has uses in social political philosophy as well. But in terms of virtue theory, she has this view that there are these, I think there's 10, but I'm not positive, capabilities. And these are, in order to live a fully good human life, we have to realize these capabilities in our lives. Now we can do them in different ways. And so play is one of the capabilities. And so she would say play is important in some, sense, and creativity and these other things. And so there's different ways of carrying that out, but so they are in good company there. Yeah. And then, like you said, when you think about it as compared to positive, or in terms of positive affect, that you get that from play. Yeah. Even Seligman there has that distinction between maybe what they think is more admirable to choose, like a value where you could go out in the world and help other people. Yeah. But play is really about positive affect, and both of them are important. Yeah. It's not that you have to choose one or the other.
Right. Yeah. I think sometimes people get messages, particularly like within our capitalist society, that to be efficient and a good productive member is the most important, and the idea of play is not productive, right? Like play is taking away from your time and energy to contribute. And
it's so, again, I come back to a regional view. It's so American, like, you get your internship, you work 80 hours a week, and you get, and I was like, what's that? It was some meeting I was in, they were talking about continuous improvement. I said, I'm exhausted already, okay? I'm not continually improving, but it's like, there's this drive, and it's just like out of control, it feels like, in our society.
Right. Yeah, and I think these theories actually, again, whether you pick and choose something from them, actually at least give you that ability to say, well, achievement is good, and also the thing we get through work is engagement or flow, which seems to be very important to a well-lived life. Yeah. But so is positive affect, and sometimes that's what you need.
Yeah. So for the people who aren't familiar with flow, do you want to give some examples of like what flow or engagement is?
Yeah, I actually think that flow is a really interesting. Do you all study it at all? Or I know I could see you're familiar with it.
Not as much in counseling, but I did in my psychology background.
In counseling and spirituality, we look at Csikszentmihalyi's writings, and and that transcendence is often accompanied by a state of flow, and then people kind of feel that they've grown beyond whatever problems but they get it in those moments of intense flow.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, and then so if I say something that doesn't agree with what you know it to be, I think the way to get people to understand what flow is some of the phenomenology of it, which is an experience you've had where time flew by. You weren't even aware that 4 hours had gone by. And you feel there's a challenge to what you're doing, but it's not too far above you so that you're frustrated, and it's not too easy so that you're bored. It's just this kind of, what's the word, the ideal place.
Sweet spot.
That's the word, the sweet spot.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and so Seligman, like I said himself, and this all coming from Csikszentmihalyi, he developed this idea of flow, which I think was it supposed to be like a positive experience like pleasure, or because it seems to be in the most recent literature that I've read, or even if you take it by Seligman, they're separating pleasure, positive affect from flow. Yeah. And I do think that seems right because, again, like there was this study I was reading recently, and they seem to think that, or at least the way the study was designed, that flow is different than a pleasurable experience, because a pleasurable experience is one in which you're pretty much aware you're having a good time or you're experiencing joy or something like that. Whereas what characterizes flow is the absence of feeling. Is that right?
Would you say like distance running fits in here?
Yeah, you're just going. Actually, the example for me in my mind of my own experiences of flow kind of fit that of it's not necessarily an experience of positive affect while I'm doing it so much. There's something that's...
It's like looking back, it's, wow, I'm glad I did, or that felt good.
It's reinforcing clearly because I'm wanting to be engaged in that flow state, but it's not necessarily the same as, I don't know, whatever, like for me, eating is like positive affect,
Absolutely.
And so, this might sound like a strange example. One of the things that I did in my undergraduate as one of my part-time jobs was I was a pharmacy technician. And so, the job in a retail setting, so the job was a lot of counting, grabbing, typing, just a lot of repetitive things. But they all had a certain level of concentration that was necessary in order to get everything right. And I found that job to be so satisfying because I was in a flow state so frequently. It was right. It was that perfect sweet spot of I'm having to concentrate, but not so much so that I can't achieve it.
You're frustrated.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're having a hard time achieving it.
And that time would just fly by. Now, I wasn't necessarily banging at the gates to go to work every day, but the time would fly because I'd be in a flow state. And so, yeah.
That's a really good example, actually.
Well, actually, I would say it is too, because this is one of the things I think is important about understanding the role of flow in our different experiences. So the big example, if you recall from your reading, was video game players. So people who are really into video games, that's why it becomes addictive. So you have to watch. But video game players, they're constantly just trying to get to that next level. And so they really get absorbed, and that's that experience. But what's interesting about flow is that, so in the study that I was reading, they distinguished flow from positive affect, and they were saying that work actually is a place where it's a prime place where we get experiences of flow. However, people still, like you said, they still might choose not to go to work because maybe the experiences on the weekend, they get positive affect from them. And there's some hobbies or pursuits that you could also have flow experiences, but there's a lot of pleasant experiences that wouldn't necessarily be, like you said, when I'm eating, it's pleasant. I'll choose it over work, but I don't even get that. And so I try to tell people that, maybe also on the flip side of not wanting to work the 8-hour work week all the time, this craving of retirement, right? But you will miss some things like the structured relationships that you have, and we haven't even talked about that, but positive relationships always, as you probably know, come up really high in studies of happiness. But flow is another one that we get from work. And there was this book a couple years ago that I read as a parent. It's her name's Jennifer Singer. She's not a philosopher, but she wrote a book primarily geared towards people who are adults, parents, not so much advice on how to parent. And she was analyzing modern parenting and how much time it takes up and some of the issues with modern parenting. And the book itself is something like the paradox of, modern parenting. I don't think that was it. All joy and no fun. Okay. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So the idea of it is, this was one where she said that the people that she even observed and interviewed, it wasn't pleasurable as they got steeped in it, but it was meaningful. On the other hand, what she was saying is that parenting does not lend itself to flow because you pick up something to do, just even fold the clothes, and you get a call from your child. Or so any activity where you're constantly being interrupted is not an activity where, it's not a circumstance that's conducive to flow. Whereas your example is a perfect one where maybe it's not particularly a pleasurable activity. You wouldn't necessarily choose to do it any old time. But because you were doing it, you were getting that experience of flow, and you were obviously left to get it done.
Yeah. Well, and even like you said before, Elliot, distance running, I experience a flow state in that it's repetitive, it's challenging, it's not necessarily enjoyable, but there's a level of I think I like that word engagement. There's a level of engagement that's necessary that feels like it's using my brain and my body in a way that maybe isn't always used in other ways.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
I feel like people often talk about creating music or playing music or art as experiences of flow as well.
Yeah, I definitely experienced that when I was playing, because I just get lost in it. And it's like, it's something that takes me out of myself is the key. I don't exist in those states of flow.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that if people want to create more experiences of flow, they should keep also that in mind that, you know, you have to try to minimize distractions and because I guess any one of these, if you think you need more of them or you want them, right, you also want to set up the conditions
And I think one
for them.
If this is a good segue point, I was thinking of the relationship one. And I keep reading all these studies about loneliness and as people get older, they're more isolated, and then people in general, and especially our society, and they have was it the UK? They have a loneliness minister.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's kind of neat, actually.
That like is kind of
progressive.
Yeah. So could you say a little bit about, because you had mentioned that so many relationships come up across different theories?
Yeah, so even in studying the philosophy of happiness, of course, you know, I look at a lot of psychology and just in popular articles and research, and it just over and over again, positive, good relationships come up as a key component to a happy life. Now, I can't say a lot. I don't know, maybe I think I could direct it back to you. I'll say something about it, about specifically how people can, I'm sure they want to know how to improve their relationships. But interestingly, when you had brought up the Stoic, and you said it's probably not very popular, it's interesting because, so Jonathan Haidt, he's a research psychologist, but he was an undergrad philosophy major. And he has this, I think it's the happiness hypothesis. And he says that when he was he was a graduate student, he thought that the Stoics were actually going to be, and the Buddhists, that was going to be the pinnacle or the key, the right view of happiness. Okay, that getting inner equanimity or calm and being able to just withstand life's you know storms without getting excited. He thought that was going to be it. But he ultimately changed his view. He thinks you have to, at least in that book, he says you have to kind of combine the Western attachment and passion that we have for things, maybe temper it with some, you know, so because we can get overexcited or something and get really upset about.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons he changed his view was, you've all heard of the principle of hedonic adaptation?
Yeah.
Okay, or adaptation. Yeah, so that we adapt more quickly to new maybe objects and things, you know, than we think we will. Now, in his studies, though, he found that there were at least 5 that I remember things that we do not adapt to on the negative side. Okay, and one of them is interpersonal conflict. Now, he claims in there that even when we've maybe cut ourselves off from those people, or I read this a while ago, so I can't remember specifically, but we do tend to ruminate about it anyway, and that interpersonal conflict, more so than maybe other work things that bother you or something, I don't know. So it is extremely important to have good relationships, and also to, probably this is where forgiveness as a virtue or as, you know, an important emotion or an important skill, like maybe it is comes up also as a component of a happy life, being a forgiving person.
Yeah, there was a dean at John Carroll, I think it was Doris Donnelly, and she wrote a lot about forgiveness, but the whole idea was that it's a way to unburden ourselves of the dissonance that comes from conflict because we don't adapt to it. And it's,
Is that,
it's a beautiful ritual in that sense.
Yeah, so that even maybe if you can't, because you can't control the other person, right? Even if you want to resolve that conflict, so that maybe forgiveness of yourself for getting upset when you did, and the person for what they did, maybe even when you can't talk to the person and resolve it, is at least some way of resolving that conflict.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because
it's, someone else described it to me as, you're not forgetting, but you're not recreating or remembering it in every similar situation. And then that means all your energy is still tied up in the dissonance and the conflict.
Yeah.
So you need a ritual to let go of it.
Right, right. So that's what I was going to ask you in your counseling, when people come in, is that is that a common issue, is interpersonal?
I would say that the majority of people I work with, one of the parts that is most distressing to them about whatever it is they're experiencing, whether it's anxious or depressive symptoms or trauma, a core concern about that is because it's affecting their relationships with other people. Of course, it's the internal pain that they might be feeling, but this is mucking up this part of my life that is also really important to me and my ability to connect.
So you would say even maybe if they came in with, like, one might imagine from the outside that a lot of people come to you are having trouble with school. Is it students? Or?
Well, here at CSU, it's other life issues that are resulting in trouble in school.
Yeah. And a lot of that might have to do with conflict with an individual.
Yeah, or it's a ripple effect. There's something going on, and in relationships with other people is one of the things that's negatively impacted, and maybe schoolwork is negatively impacted.
Yeah.
But that's a core thing. I don't know about you, Elliot, with clients. People are often, because we use this thing called the miracle question, which people are pretty familiar with, is, when someone's having a hard time defining what it is they want to come out of their counseling experience, because we try to get people to identify a general goal for counseling so that it feels like we're not just meandering, but moving towards something. And for some folks who are having a hard time identifying what their goal is, we ask them the miracle question, which is, if you woke up tomorrow and the thing in your life that you wanted to be different was different, how would you know that it was different? Like, you got out of bed, and if no one told you, what would be different in your life? And very often people come back to the way they interact with other people or the way people interact with them would be the sign that the thing had changed.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's, I would wake up and so-and-so would be talking to me again. Or I could talk to this person, or I could communicate, or I'd feel this way with these people. Relationships seem to be the barometer for how an internal issue is impacting them.
Yeah. I think that's a really good example.
So is forgiveness something you do talk about, or?
Well, yeah, particularly related to people with traumatic experiences in their background, where it's like, there is nothing that the person can do to undo what had happened. And that there's a part of them, too, I think in particular, I have a quote like on a magnet on my fridge, and I can't remember who it's attributed to, and maybe it's just a quote that pops up everywhere, but it's like, to understand everything is to forgive everything. And it's this idea of, how can I develop an understanding for why that person acted that way, even if I don't, I wish it didn't happen that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, well, like with sexual abuse, there are people, they had adults in their lives who did not take care of them, and they may even be dead now. And then, so it's just like, okay, how do I, get inside what was going on for those people?
And maybe it's not always even forgiveness, it's this concept of acceptance. And what I always say is, like, acceptance doesn't equal liking. You don't have to like everything that you accept, but can you understand something as it is without judgment, kind of a detached sense of understanding. And so part of that is, like, how can I develop acceptance for how someone treated me, or a thing that has happened to me in my life, or a circumstance.
Right. Yeah.
Because sometimes there's no one to forgive. Sometimes it's like the cards of life dealt you an experience, and there's no one person responsible for it.
Yeah. I do think that, although when somebody is seeking that kind of treatment, I do think Stoicism itself actually has a connection to cognitive behavioral psychology, right? And trying to get a more accurate understanding so that you are releasing this thing that you don't have control over, or I don't know, when somebody is dealt just a bad hand by fate, is there, because, I think I have done this, or do this, that you somehow do blame yourself still, like that why was I in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was there something I could have, and I think that is what that is that sort of getting that detached that it just is. It sucks this happened, but it just did.
Yeah.
And that is some level of acceptance.
I think with traumas and things like assaults and people, we have a fight, flight, freeze. You don't know which system you've got until you're in the situation. And you may, I knew people who trained for martial arts in years, and then when they were attacked, they froze. And again, the first position was self-blame, but it was like, no, you have to understand that is billions of years of evolution trying to keep you safe. It's not the model of nervous system that you would like. You would like the fight back, whatever, but that's what you got. And it was trying to do its job.
Yeah, well, and I think for some people, that mindset of like, what could I have done differently is speaking to a desire to want to have control over aspects of life that one is trying to reconcile their lack of control. So there's something that's like attractive about it of like, what could I have done differently if I internalize this? I can prevent this from happening. But for me, what I more so try to help people understand is how do we cope with what we cannot control? It's not to say that we don't take responsibility where we can in life, but where do we find that balance of what do we have to develop some level of acceptance with?
Yeah, I mean, that is what the Stoics try to counsel us to realize is, now maybe Epictetus in particular, the ancient Stoic, overshot in thinking of what we can't control. There's more maybe externally we can. We can take steps towards our goals and things like that. But they... they think that our expectations, oftentimes when we're really disappointed, it's that our expectations are for the world are too high, or even how other people should act. There was this video I use in my class, and this he's an author, and he's doing like a little bit of applied stoicism, and he's trying to counsel this taxi cab driver in London, I think it is, or somewhere in Europe. And the guy just continually every day for years gets really mad at drivers. He's like, do you think maybe it's your expectations and not necessarily, maybe you should lower those. You go into it every day thinking today's the perfect day. Nobody's going to do anything that doesn't agree with how I think they should drive. And so we do all have those internal oughts, right, about how the world ought to work, how these people ought to respond to me. That's veering off, of course, the difficult issue of trauma. But
well, but I think it is because I mean some work in trauma is helping people reconcile how the world is versus how they believed it to be before the trauma, because the trauma impacts our core beliefs from certain perspectives about how the world really is.
And what you could have expected from it, or...
Right, like that parents will be this way, or people don't do this, or, just inherently like the world is a safe place. I mean, I think we all cognitively recognize that it's not, but there's when it's really, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess when something so awful happens to us that we recognize that maybe the world is much more dangerous and scary than we thought. It's about helping people reconcile that, but not necessarily let it control their life, because for some people after a traumatic experience, they start behaving in ways that are really maladaptive to themselves and other people, and in an effort to keep themselves safe, it goes so far to cut themselves off from other people. So kind of how it ought or should be.
And now when they've been through that, it kind of switches to this other, I have to completely protect myself because it's totally unsafe or something like that.
Right, yeah, we don't want it to go that far, because then maybe a person could be living out their life in a way that's so far in the other direction that it's causing them pain. And I remember one of the things that you had jotted some thoughts down were about post-traumatic grauth.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is a...
Yeah, and I thought it was a good point in the Seligman book that people do grow after traumas, and we think of PTSD and we emphasize again the clinical presentation. But I would say, from my perspective at least, it's existentially. In ego development, we know people would say, how do you go from conventional to a post-conventional sense of self? We don't know exactly, but we know life crises push a lot of people across that boundary, because they have to. It's like they have to either fit it into how they see the world now, or they have to grow a bigger sense of the world to include it.
Right.
And so it's like an assimilation accommodation, right? But,
right. And that's part of that post-traumatic development, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Getting from that place of protection to
yeah, this is a bigger, deeper world that I'm actually in, and accepting that, but also not letting the trauma dictate the map of the world.
When you're dealing with these really deep issues and traumas that we've been talking about, how does it sound to your ears then to focus on? Because a lot of that is just trying to help people return to some level of functioning, and that's a big step in progress. How does it sound to your ears to talk about happiness, which sounds, I hope I haven't presented as a light topic.
No, I think it's.
Well, how does it sound in terms of, because it's kind of like, there was something I was reading about just, for example, the goals of medicine in general. And is it to, it's to treat people and return them to a normal functioning, but some may treat the trying to help people become happier. It's like self-help. I mean, right, it sounds shallow, but as an enhancement and not really, one of the goals of medicine or something like that, or treatment and therapy.
See, I love it because I think particularly for people who have experienced trauma and for people who have been in historically marginalized social and cultural groups who, the aim has been to survive, I think it's empowering to think about pursuing happiness in these different ways because it feels like an act of resistance. Like I was, nearly emotionally wiped out or physically wiped out from these circumstances. And so a way to fight back against that is to develop one's well-being as much as possible. So I see it as an act of empowerment, but I know that it's easy for me to kind of take that positive
I agree too.
view.
I was just curious,
When I think some people who have suffered traumas go through like a chrysalis sort of, that it changed them. They didn't want to be changed. But then when they move into, okay, now who am I and what is life about? And in doing that, they make, a broader, deeper meaning that allows them to function.
Right.
And then and pursue things like meaning and relationships and engagement or happiness, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, and I even have to say for myself, as much as I am drawn to the ancient, this deeper idea of happiness and thinking about it in terms of well-being or flourishing, and that not necessarily is it just being in a good mood, okay? On the other hand,
let's face it, people who are consistently in a good mood.
I'd like to be in a better one.
But they're a little weird. They're a little scary. I'm always like, there's a guy I know who's always in a really good mood. And it doesn't matter what's happening, but he's just got this kind of smile. And I didn't realize this until years later. His ex-wife is like, he was stoned all the time.
Oh my God. Well, there you go.
That explains a lot. Yeah.
Well, until you said that, I was thinking that actually goes back to the Seligman book also, because he does say he wanted to broaden his understanding of happiness because there are people who have well-being and that you would want to emulate, but they're not all high on the high mood scale, whatever that scale is. But what I was going to say is that as much as I'm drawn to this deeper theory, and I definitely am interested in meaning and, those ideas, I also am very drawn in a funny way to hedonism. And this, because sometimes when a person's affect has dipped so far down, the immediate interest is in, trying to lift their affect. And there's one other kind of finding in psychology that you've probably heard, but I think it always bears reminding as to why this can be an important study. It used to be the common sense thinking was that if you could get these external goals, well, when you ask people what would make you happy, right, and they say career success, a good relationship, friends, all these, right, and we treat getting those, then the effect of that is happiness. And this important finding, which sounds sort of simplistic, is that actually they have found it somewhat the reverse, that people who are happy are more successful in their marriages. Their people are more drawn to them. If you're optimistic, of course, and resilient, and you have these certain qualities, people, of course, you can maintain positive relationships. It can be important to career success. And then some people will talk about how these things sort of reinforce each other, right? Like being happy will maybe whatever those qualities are helps you to be resilient and persistent in pursuing your goals. And then when you have career success and you make more money, that in turn reinforces your happiness. So I think
really
that does
important.
give us a reason to want to take an interest in people's happiness.
Sure.
Yeah.
If it itself can play a role in...
I was thinking of there's a theory of interpersonal depression with kids, especially because for children, they show it so baldly on their face and with their body language. And we found that if you coached the kid in acting as if he was happy or she was happy, what happens is they have more playmates at recess time.
Really?
Yeah, this is with smaller kids, but it's like, we say you fake it till you make it, but it's really, it's because they learn how to like, well, how do I look when I'm feeling good or when I'm happy? They find a way to kind of try that on, and then other kids move toward them as opposed to a way.
That.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, yeah. I remember reading that a few years ago, like if you put a smile on your face, you actually will feel better. But maybe it's true.
There's something
With the
to
kids.
it.
I mean, there's something to it. The kids,
that was, what do they call that? Seligman had this thing. He looked at a 1952 baseball roster. It was a study, and they called it a sincere smile as a Duchenne smile, this French researcher who kind of looked at, well, what's in a smile when someone's genuinely happy.
Yeah.
So the baseball players who had these Duchenne smiles, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, lived like 7 years longer than the ones who were sort of scowling to the camera.
Can you show us that smile?
Oh, I know.
We need that.
Yeah.
It ain't on my driver's license, I'll tell you that. I'm like,
You're not allowed to, right?
I know. I saw that.
Yeah, so, I mean, like I said, so there is something to all this, and that finding I always thought, while not the most profound finding in maybe the study of happiness, I thought it does really give us a reason to take a serious interest in it if it itself, like I said, can be, a cause of helping people. And I think that study with the children does kind of show it, or,
So it sounds like, so obviously I think we're all feeling like these are important aspects of the human experience to cultivate. Just because of all of your focus and you're teaching a course on it, do you have overall kind of guidelines for students or listeners about happiness and ways to start exploring that for themselves?
Yeah, take PHL 175. So I will say in that course we do broadly, it is a survey course, and so we lay out these 3 broad theories, and then we study the different philosophers under them. I think, as I've been saying, I think some return to the ancient ideas and this idea of, happiness as being something of an internal matter. And, I do think that, that's where you want to start. And I also think that, critical thinking, well, it's sort of laying a foundation. We really haven't gotten into, but there's a lot of fallacies, of course, that people have about not just happiness, but in wanting. When they want something, we use our emotions, and we have these cognitive illusions that cause us to want things that ultimately don't really make us happy. And so I do think that philosophy has as much to, I think philosophers should pay attention to some of this good psychology, as I think I've made clear, but I do think philosophy, and I think Seligman's kind of a nice, when I saw that he sort of was on this idea about, flourishing and kind of like the capabilities theory, these components of well-being, I thought the philosophers we were right about something here, and so as much as I think we shouldn't ignore that, I do think philosophy itself and thinking about the nature of happiness and getting clear, like, well, maybe it's not what I'm doing, it's the way I'm thinking about what my life should be like.
Right.
It's kind of like, you could use the metaphor of like social media, right? Where is it really about great lunches with close friends and every day you're dressed perfectly or whatever, or driving whatever car, or is it something that we carry with us into the situations? Those comparative approaches to happiness. So-and-so's doing this.
Yeah.
And why am I not doing that?
Right.
don't worry about that. What do you want to do?
Right. Yeah. Now, if you want to say, and this is just my own personal view, I think that, what do they call that? FOMO? Fear of missing
Fear of
out.
missing out.
Right. And how social media can lend itself to that. And knowing that personal relationships are so important to our happiness, I think we've got to do better on that. And, you know, get straight on social media and its role, and especially for young people who don't have the judgment yet to sort those things out, or, you know.
Yeah, knowing friending is not being a friend.
Right,
It's different.
Actually, out of curiosity, since you see students come in and take your class and leave, what are some of the things they say that they are getting? I mean, obviously they're learning the material, this content, but I'm assuming it's impacting them in their sense of what happiness is, and what. So what do they get out of the class, do they tell you?
Yeah, so I also do have them test some of these out. So, like, I'll have them do, like, a week where they have to make a plan and live like a stoic, or, you know, and see what they can get out of that. Or, and so they'll definitely, in those projects especially, they'll reveal that even if they don't think that, kind of like you said, it was too popular at the beginning, that, you know, they really gleaned something from it, and changing their views about. I think a lot of students will come in thinking that it really is about positive mood and career success, and, you know, I do think I do think the ancients, and maybe just because of my interest in that. And that third component, or that third theory of happiness, on you know, happiness is eudaimonia. It's something they haven't really heard as much before, and so they do like that part of the course. Yeah.
I think it's probably a helpful antidote to the kind of, I'm assuming, the hedonistic perspective that most people are exposed to. Yeah,
and actually, it's interesting though. On the flip side of that. Students are definitely more, maybe pushed too far, that the eudaimonists make happiness too much of an objective matter, that it's, you could tick off a list, and if you have these, that's what happiness is. They definitely remain committed to the idea of personal happiness. And I think that's where I want to just be able to influence them, not necessarily even completely change their mind about that. Because especially when you're young, I think it's important to have some drive that, no, this is going to make me happy. And maybe that's what, by our late 20s, mid 30s, helps us accumulate and lay that foundation. And maybe it's later that we start moving towards, when we've experienced maybe trauma or midlife, and, you know, it's not all adding up to what we thought. That's where we start shifting our views. But, you know, but I like when they're influenced by learning about these other perspectives, and then also, you know, broadening their conception of, it's not just what I think it is, or it's not just, these feel-good moments or something.
And when something that kind of I popped into my mind is that, you know, fewer and fewer Americans talk about identifying with a religion. And, you know, I was at one point heading toward the Anglican priesthood, and so I got educated in more of the esoteric aspects of the faith, but it was also about these things like character building, moral compasses, which, so that whole social institutional piece has really dropped from so many people's lives. And so it's good for them to have another place to go.
Yeah, and I probably haven't emphasized that enough, the virtue aspect of the ancients and character development. And it's also a little bit about, when you work on developing your character, or at least some kinds of traits of, like, not getting angry as quickly, or whatever the case may be. It doesn't even have to be that lofty as becoming, virtue in the lofty sense we think of it. It is another way of just taking control and working on what you can, I guess, and not, distancing yourself a little bit from the things you can't control. And which, again, taking control, and lack of control was another one of those that we don't adapt to when we feel like we don't have control over our lives. Yeah. So a couple of interesting ones on there, just in case, for those who want to know, are noise and a busy commute.
I am
adapt to
totally down with both of those.
Well, so the noise, a busy commute, lack of control, interpersonal conflict.
And the fifth one that I recall, and I have a hard time explaining exactly what he means, people maybe resist it a little bit, is he classifies it under shame. And he actually says that there are certain, maybe even physical, like, appearance issues that when people did have, as much as we think cosmetic surgery is shallow, when people were able to, and I don't think this is just somebody who wants higher cheekbones or something. It's, where they may have had some kind of very obvious
cleft palate or something.
Something like that it actually, it contributes much more robustly to their happiness for a longer period than we would realize. We don't adapt to that. Having that or something like that. I'd want to go back and read exactly what the nature of that one was. But lack of control is definitely one of them. And so I think it's always worth trying to find ways that we can take some control, even when we can't control the external.
So if I have to commute, I can listen to podcasts.
That's fine. Right.
Exactly.
They'll probably get a back and forth.
So I think it's okay to put a plug in for the class. What's the number and the name of the course?
Oh, it's Philosophy 175, Philosophy of Happiness. And it's offered in the spring at 8:30 a.m. I don't know if it's full yet, and then usually it's in the fall at 10 a.m.
Yeah. Occasionally, some of our master's students take an undergraduate course for a variety of reasons, and I think, wow, what a really cool course for them to take.
You know who else really likes the course is the Project 60 folks. And they really, the students, somewhere along the line will often say that they really benefited from having the Project 60 people in there because they've had life experience now and they bring a different, definitely different perspective on it from people who are just starting out and, I don't know what you all know, but would you say that young people look at happiness really more in terms of achieving these external reward or achievements and goals generally, or you mentioned they have a hedonistic view?
It depends. I think our students are a bit of an anomaly because they're in the counseling field, so I think they're spending more time thinking about these things.
They may be meaning-oriented already.
But I think about when I worked with psychology undergraduates who are quote-unquote traditionally aged college students, like 18, 19, 20, I think they would be apt to say positive affect is happiness. But maybe not necessarily because that's what they actually think, but rather maybe they hadn't been exposed to other ideas of what happiness could be.
Right. Yeah. Right.
They haven't maybe even thought about it.
Yeah, truly, I think it's they hadn't thought about it.
So it's like a pop quiz. Happiness.
Feeling good.
Feeling good.
Yeah, and we do. We do that on the first day. I always just say, tell me just what comes to your mind, and positive affect comes up quite a bit. And the other thing, like I said, that comes up is personal happiness, and that it's really everybody has their idea about what happiness is, and pursuing their idea of it. And I think some of the ideas do challenge that, and that's what they're here for too. To be challenged and learn those.
Yeah.
And what I'm finding, at least, is I think it's great to have the Project 60 people in there, but so one of the existential givens, aging, a lot of things that I used to find meaningful, or I've had to dial down, or I've had to adjust them, or and it's when I looked at my folks who my dad lived to be 94, and he just said, you got to keep. He said you got to keep ahead of the curve and just keep adjusting as needed.
Right. Well, I think them being here is already staying ahead of the curve and adjusting, or not being complacent about retirement, or I mean, and do you all get them in your classes or no?
Project 60 students. I've had one Project 60, and for people who aren't familiar, the Project 60 program allows people over the age of 60, correct, to audit CSU courses.
Actually,
any?
I think it's any state college or
that's so cool.
State.
So we don't normally get them in our courses because there's just certain kind of, I don't know.
Because you can take a few as a non-degree, but otherwise they're degree-seeking.
So we don't. Yeah, I've had. Yeah, I think one that I can think of.
Well, you can imagine philosophy.
Oh,
now
sure.
This is when you want to study that. So we get them, and And some of them, they'll take several philosophy courses. And I know one guy was taking 3 or 4. And then, they take, of course, they probably do tend more towards the liberal arts. So they'll stick around. He was in my class last spring, and he had been in my philosophy of happiness. That was bioethics. He'd been in my philosophy of happiness course like 2 years ago,
Yeah.
So
I think what we do get are more people doing a second career.
Yeah.
And so they've done a lot of searching about what's going to be meaningful, and that's prompted them to, retire and then go into our program.
Yeah, I always love the diversity of our students who are doing a second career move because they come from such interesting backgrounds, like accounting or just stuff that appears on its face so different than counseling.
Yeah.
But maybe that's why.
It seemed like well, so we have hit on a lot of points. So hopefully listeners have gotten a broader, deeper sense of what happiness can be, some clues about some people to read if they're looking at some of these ancients or Martin Seligman, a contemporary.
do you think we gave them anything they could apply topically?
Oh, yeah. I hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you woke up in a bad mood today,
Yeah.
it was one of Martin Seligman's exercises. Write about 3 good things that happen to you every day.
Right, and why?
And why.
Why you think that occurred. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting one.
Yeah, try that for a few days, folks, if you want a prescription to apply.
Yeah.
Well,
And smile.
And smile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do the what kind of smile?
Smile, the Duchenne
The
smile.
Duchenne smile.
Yeah,
I need to go Google
Google it.
image
Yes.
this now. What is the Duchenne
check
smile?
it out. Yeah, because they've got every examples from Joe Biden to like James Cagney and just all of these faces and all the physiological features.
Fascinating.
It's a song too, isn't it? Smile when your heart is breaking, something like that. So anyway, thank you, Tony, so much for joining us.
Well,
and
thank you for
opening
having
this
me
up.
and contacting me and doing
Thank
this.
you so much.
Yeah, and
It's been really interesting.
if you're interested in bioethics, Tony's podcast is Conversations in Bioethics. So please check it out. Anything else from you, Stephanie?
I got nothing.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
thanks again.
Thank you for listening to Conversations in Bioethics, a podcast brought to you by the Cleveland State Department of Philosophy and Comparative Religion. Produced by faculty member Tony Nicoletti in conjunction with the Center for Instructional Technology and Distance Learning. For more information about the Department of Philosophy and Comparative Religion course offerings, please visit our website at csuohio.edu or call 216-687-3900.